The rope was already measured for her neck when she realized the truth. The queen had known everything from the very beginning, not suspected, not been misled, known. Elira Voss stood in the cold stone cell beneath Thornhold Castle, wrists raw from iron, and replayed the queen's face in the throne room, not confused, not betrayed, not even angry. Calm. A calmness that only comes from a decision already made long before the accusation was ever spoken aloud. 15 years. 15 years Elira had given this crown, as a scribe's apprentice at 12, as royal seneschal at 26, as the woman who balanced the kingdom's ledgers, fed its starving villages, and stood at the queen's shoulder through 3 wars and 1 plague. And in one single week, all of it had been rewritten into a single word: traitor. Tomorrow at dawn they would walk her to the square, read that word to the crowd, and open her throat for the birds. Tonight, a single guard she had once saved from a flogging would come to her door with a key he should not have. And in that moment, Elira Voss would make a choice that no execution, no crown, and no queen would ever be able to undo. She would live long enough to make every single person who buried her alive regret that she hadn't stayed in the ground. Nobody remembers the day Elira Voss became indispensable, because there wasn't one day. There were 1,000 small days, stacked one on top of the other, until the kingdom of Virelane could no longer imagine running without her. She had come to Thornhold Castle as a girl of 12, the daughter of a bookkeeper from the River District, clutching a satchel of borrowed ledgers and a reference letter written in her mother's careful hand. The old seneschal, a stooped man named Voss, no relation, though the name stuck to her like a second skin when he took her as his apprentice, saw something in the girl that made him keep her. She did not simply add numbers. She saw the story hiding inside them. A grain shipment 2 days late meant a bridge was flooded 3 villages over. A tax return 0.5% low meant a lord was skimming, or a harvest was failing quietly before anyone dared report it. By the time she was 20. The old seneschal was dead, and the position was hers not by inheritance, but because the young queen Marin Thalira, barely older than Elira herself, newly crowned after her father's sudden death, trusted no one else to hold the kingdom's numbers and by extension its truths. "You don't flatter me," Marin told her once, on a night when the two of them sat alone over a candle and a spread of unpaid debts left by the old king. "Everyone else in this castle tells me what I want to hear. You tell me what the numbers say. I need that more than I need comfort." Elira had believed her. For years, she had built her entire sense of worth around that sentence. She rose early, slept late, and learned to read a room before she ever opened her mouth in it. She learned which lords smiled with their teeth and which smiled with their eyes. And she learned, most dangerously of all, to trust the wrong ones simply because the queen trusted them first. Chief among them was Lord Cashin Dreath, the queen's cousin, golden-haired, quick with a joke, quicker with a blade, and utterly certain that the crown belonged in some unspoken way to him as much as to Marin. He had opposed Elira's appointment from the very first year, calling her the merchant's daughter with a counting-house heart, always with a smile that made the insult sound like affection. Marin had laughed it off. Elira had learned to smile back and say nothing, filing the memory away the way she filed everything, carefully, permanently, in a place she rarely opened. It was Cashin who first proposed the grain treaty with the neighboring kingdom of Rothmere, 3 years into Marin's reign, when a failed harvest threatened famine across Virelane's eastern provinces. It was Cashin who insisted the shipments be routed through the border town of Ashmere, under his personal oversight, for speed, cousin, nothing more. And it was Elira, cautious, meticulous Elira, who quietly flagged the arrangement in her private ledgers as unusual, then said nothing. Because Marin had already agreed to it in open council, and questioning Cashin's judgment in front of the court had by then become a quiet kind of treason all its own. She told herself she was being careful. In truth, she was being afraid. And fear, she would learn far too late, is the one ledger that always eventually comes due. The eastern famine deepened faster than anyone predicted. Villages that should have received grain within a month received nothing within 3. Reports came in of children too weak to walk to temple, of riots breaking out in Ashmere itself, of merchants hoarding what little remained and selling it back to starving farmers at 10 times its worth. The council convened in an emergency session, torches burning late into the night, and every eye in that stone hall turned inevitably to the 2 people responsible for the treaty's oversight, Lord Cashin Dreath and Elira Voss. Cashin spoke first. He always did. "I trusted the seneschal's ledgers completely," he said, his voice heavy with performed regret, his hand resting just once, just briefly, on the back of the queen's chair. "If the numbers were falsified, I had no way of knowing. That was never my office." Elira felt the room shift before she understood why. She looked at the ledgers spread across the table, her ledgers in her handwriting, except for 3 pages near the back, that she did not recognize entries she had never made, sums she had never calculated. All of it stitched so carefully into her own careful script that even she for one terrible heartbeat doubted her own memory. She looked up. Marin was not looking at Cashin. Marin was looking at her. And for the first time in 15 years, Elira Voss saw something in the Queen's eyes that had never been there before, not once, not even during the worst nights of war and plague. Doubt aimed directly at her. The council chamber had gone utterly silent, the kind of silence that has weight, that presses against the ribs. Elira could hear her own pulse in her ears, could hear the sputter of the torches, could hear, absurdly, the far-off bark of a dog somewhere beyond the castle walls, going about its evening as though the world had not just tilted sideways beneath her feet. "These are not my entries," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, which surprised her almost as much as the forged pages themselves. "Look at the ink, look at the hand. I have kept these ledgers for 11 years, Your Grace. I know my own writing the way I know my own face. Forgery is precisely what a guilty hand would claim," Cashin said gently, as though he pitied her for having to say it. "I do not accuse lightly, Elira, you know that. But 3 separate merchant houses in Ashmere have sworn statements that grain meant for the eastern villages was diverted and sold under authorization bearing your seal. My seal is kept in the seneschal's office, under lock. You have had access to that office as often as I have, cousin to the crown." The word landed harder than she meant it to. Somewhere along the table a lord she did not know well shifted uncomfortably, and she understood. With the sick clarity of someone watching a wall collapse in slow motion, that she had just accused the Queen's own blood of treason in open council with nothing but her own certainty to stand on. Cashin did not flinch. He turned instead to Marin, his expression arranging itself into something wounded and patient, a man absorbing an unfair blow because he loved his queen too much to defend himself with anger. "I understand grief does strange things to loyalty," he said quietly. "She has served you a long time. I do not wish to see her punished beyond what is just, but Your Grace, people are dying in Ashmere. Someone profited from their hunger. The ledgers point to the seneschal's office. The seal points to the seneschal's office. I did not write these entries, cousin, but I fear very much that someone did and used a friendship to hide behind. It was masterful." Elira understood that even as it was happening to her, even as the noose of it tightened around her chest, he had not accused her outright. He had simply arranged the facts like stones in a path and let the council walk themselves to the only conclusion the stones allowed. Marin rose from her chair. She was pale, and for one fragile instant, Elira thought she saw something break behind the Queen's composed face. A flicker of the girl who used to fall asleep against Elira's shoulder during the long budget nights of her first year on the throne. Who used to call her the only honest voice in this whole gilded room. "I want a formal inquiry," Marin said, and her voice did not shake, though Elira would later wonder how much that had cost her to arrange. "Lord Cashin, you will surrender the Ashmere shipment records to the royal investigators. Seneschal Voss," she paused. It was only a heartbeat, but Elira felt it stretch into years. "You are relieved of your seal and your office pending the inquiry's findings. You will remain within the castle grounds." It was not yet a condemnation. Elira told herself that later, alone in the small guest chamber they moved her to, stripped of the office that had been her entire adult life in the space of one sentence. It was not yet a condemnation. The Queen had used the word inquiry, not treason. There was still a version of this where the truth crawled its way out from under Cashin's careful stones and found the light. She spent the next 4 days building that version herself. Working from memory from the shadow ledgers she had always kept in her own private hand as backup. A habit her old master had drilled into her trust, nothing that exists in only one copy, girl, not even your own memory. She wrote down every shipment date, every merchant name, every discrepancy she had noticed and dismissed as none of her business over 3 years of Cashin's personal oversight of the Ashmere route. It was not proof. It was worse than that. It was a map that pointed unmistakably at Cashin, but with no single piece of it strong enough to survive a challenge in open court, especially not from the mouth of the woman already under suspicion. On the 5th night, Captain Bren Halloway, a broad, quiet man who had guarded the seneschal's office for 6 years and had never once needed to raise his voice at her, came to her door with a look she did not like. "They found something," he said. "In your old office, behind the false panel in the ledger cabinet." Elira went cold from the inside out. She had never installed a false panel in her ledger cabinet. She had never even known it existed. "What did they find, Bren?" He would not meet her eyes. "Gold," he said. A great deal of it Rothmere coin, and a letter in a hand the investigators are calling yours. The trial, because that was what it became, whatever polite name the council gave it, lasted 3 days. And Elira would remember almost none of the specific words spoken, only the sensation of watching her own life narrated back to her by strangers as though it belonged to someone else. A merchant she had never met swore he'd received instructions bearing her seal. A guard testified to seeing a woman matching her description near the Ashmere warehouses on a night Elira could prove from her own private ledger that she had been in Thornhold reconciling the winter tax returns until well past midnight, except that ledger too had vanished from her rooms sometime during the second night of the inquiry, and no one seemed particularly interested in searching for it. She watched Cashin throughout all 3 days, watched him play the part of the reluctant witness so perfectly that she found herself almost admiring the architecture of it, the way a person might admire a beautifully constructed trap even while caught inside it. He never raised his voice. He never overargued. He simply answered every question with the exact amount of regret required to seem human and let the forged evidence do the rest of the work for him. On the final morning, Marin sat upon the high seat of judgment. Robed in the deep court blue reserved for matters of treason, and Elira understood, looking up at her from the accused's floor, that whatever remained of the girl who used to fall asleep on her shoulder had been folded away somewhere Elira could no longer reach. The evidence, Marin said, and her voice carried the particular flatness of someone reciting words she had rehearsed so many times they no longer felt real, is substantial. Diverted grain, falsified authorization, foreign gold hidden within your own office, seneschal, former seneschal. 15 years of service does not erase what the ledgers show. It does not erase the children who died in Ashmere while that gold sat behind your cabinet wall. Your Grace. Elira's voice cracked on the address, the first crack she had allowed herself in 5 days. You know my hand, you have read 1,000 pages of my writing. Look at the letter they claim is mine and tell me to my face that you believe I wrote it. For one unbearable moment, Marin's composure wavered. Her eyes dropped just slightly, just for a breath, to the parchment in the investigator's hands, and something crossed her face that was not quite doubt but was not quite certainty either. It was the last honest thing Elira would ever see pass across the Queen's expression, and she held on to it, later in the dark of the condemned cell, the way a drowning woman holds onto driftwood. Then Cashin, standing at the Queen's right hand where he had stood for every hour of the trial, leaned down and murmured something too quiet for the chamber to hear. Whatever it was, it settled Marin's face back into its rehearsed flatness like a stone dropping into still water. The council finds Elira Voss guilty of treason against the crown of Virelane, Marin said, for the diversion of famine grain, the falsification of royal seals, and the acceptance of foreign gold from the kingdom of Rothmere in exchange for the suffering of Virelane's own people. Sentence is death, to be carried out at dawn 3 days hence in the square before Thornhold Gate. There was no ceremony to how they took her down to the cells beneath the castle, no final words exchanged, no farewell glance from the throne. Just hands on her arms, iron on her wrists, and the long cold descent into stone. She did not cry that first night. She had expected to. And the absence of it frightened her more than the sentence itself, as though some essential part of her had already recognized that grief was a luxury for people who still believed the world owed them fairness, and she no longer had the right to that belief. Instead, lying on the thin cot in the dark, she made herself do the one thing that had kept her alive and useful for 15 years. She went back to the numbers, not the false ones. The true ones, the ones only she still carried now in her memory alone, every date, every discrepancy, every small silence she had kept out of fear of questioning a man too close to the crown. She built the ledger again in her mind line by line. And this time she let herself see clearly, and without flinching, exactly how long Cashin Dreath had been robbing his own cousin's kingdom, and exactly how completely he had been willing to bury an innocent woman alive to keep doing it. If she was going to die wearing the word traitor, she decided somewhere in the black hours before dawn, then she would at least die having understood, with total and unforgiving clarity, precisely who the real one was. What she did not yet know, what she could not have known, curled on that cold stone floor with 3 days left to live, was that the same Captain Bren Halloway, who had once flogged himself with guilt over failing to protect her office, was even now standing watch outside her cell, turning a stolen key over and over in his coat pocket, trying to work up the courage to become a traitor of his own. Bren Halloway had guarded doors his entire adult life. He had never once, in 19 years of service, opened one he wasn't ordered to. He told himself, standing in the torchlit corridor 2 nights before the execution, that this was different. Elira Voss had pulled him out of a magistrate's flogging block 6 years ago, back when he was a 19-year-old guard who'd let a smuggler slip past the eastern gate. Everyone else in that court wanted him whipped and dismissed as an example. She had stood up, a mere assistant seneschal then, barely more senior than he was, and argued calmly and with numbers that dismissing a trained guard over one mistake cost the crown more than the mistake itself. She had never once mentioned it again. Never called in the debt, never even seemed to remember she'd done it. He remembered. He had thought about it every single day since, the particular kindness of a person who saves you and then lets you keep your dignity by never bringing it up. The key in his coat pocket belonged to the lower cell block, copied from the master set 3 nights ago. In a moment of trembling, sweating audacity, he still couldn't quite believe he'd survived. He had told no one. Not his fellow guards, not his wife, not even the small, insistent voice in his own skull that kept listing, in exhausting detail, every way this could end with his own head on the block beside Elira's. When he finally slid the key into the lock, his hands were shaking so badly it took 3 tries. Elira was awake. She was always awake. These past 2 nights, he'd checked on her rounds and found her sitting upright in the dark each time, eyes open, unmoving, like a woman conserving every last drop of herself for something. "Bren," her voice was rough with disuse. "You shouldn't be here." "I know," he pushed the door open. "Come on now before the shift changes." She didn't move at first. He watched something complicated cross her face, hope, and beneath the hope a fear so much larger than hope that for one terrible second he thought she might refuse. "If they catch you," she said, "it's not just your head, Bren, it's your family's disgrace. Your children will carry your name like a wound for the rest of their lives. They're already going to bury an innocent woman in 3 days and call it justice," he said. "I'd rather my children carry the name of a man who tried to stop that than the name of a man who watched it happen and did nothing." He held out his hand. "Please, we don't have time for you to talk me out of this. I've had 4 days to talk myself out of it and I couldn't manage it either." She took his hand. The route he'd mapped led through the old servants' passage behind the kitchens, a corridor so narrow and forgotten that even the castle steward barely remembered it existed, down through a drainage tunnel that led out into the ravine below the eastern wall. It was the same tunnel, Elira realized with a bitter, distant kind of irony, that smugglers had reportedly used to move stolen grain out of Ashmere, a route she now suspected Cashin himself had first identified years ago and simply never mentioned to anyone. They moved in silence through the dark, Bren leading with a shuttered lantern, Elira following in a stolen guard's cloak that smelled of leather and someone else's sweat. Twice they froze at the sound of footsteps overhead, pressed flat against damp stone while boots passed on the level above. And both times, Elira found herself doing something she hadn't done in years, praying wordlessly to whatever old river gods her mother used to whisper to over the ledgers of her childhood. When they finally emerged into the ravine, the night air hit her like a physical blow, cold and enormous and full of stars she hadn't seen in 5 days of stone ceiling. "There's a horse tied a half-mile north," Bren said quietly. "Supplies for 3 days. I couldn't get more without someone noticing. I'm sorry. You got me out of a death sentence with a stolen key and your own neck on the line," Elira said. "Don't you dare apologize to me for the size of a saddlebag." He almost smiled. Then his face turned serious in the starlight, and he said the thing she suspected he'd been building toward since he first opened the cell door. "Where will you go?" Elira looked north toward the dark tree line and then, almost involuntarily, back south. Toward the torchlit silhouette of Thornhold Castle, rising against the night sky, the place that had been the only home she'd known since she was 12 years old, the place that had just tried to kill her for a crime someone else committed. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "But I know this, I am not running to hide, Bren, I'm running to build something. And when I come back through those gates again, it will not be as a prisoner." He studied her for a long moment, this quiet, broken, unbowed woman standing in a stolen cloak in the middle of the night, and something in his chest settled, the particular relief of a man who has finally done the one right thing in a life full of following orders. "Then I hope, whatever you're building," he said, "you'll remember there's at least one guard in that castle who'd rather serve the truth than the crown when the time comes to choose." She would remember it for a very long time. The horse carried her 3 days north and west, away from the fertile heartlands of Virelane and into the tangled outskirts of Kelmore, a sprawling port city built into the cliffs above a gray, restless sea famous throughout the kingdom for exactly one thing: it belonged to no one. Lords claimed taxes from it on paper. In practice, Kelmore answered to whoever controlled its docks, its guilds, and its endless maze of underground taverns, and had done so for 200 years regardless of who sat the throne in Thornhold. Elira arrived at its outer gates on the evening of the fourth day, exhausted, filthy, and utterly friendless in a city built entirely on the principle that friendship was simply a transaction that hadn't been priced yet. She had chosen Kelmore deliberately. A woman fleeing a treason charge, with a queen's soldiers likely combing every honest village between here and the border needed somewhere the honest didn't go. And Elira, for all her 15 years of careful, upright service, understood better than most exactly what kind of city thrived on the mistakes of people like Cashin Dreeth. She sold Bren's stolen guard cloak for coin on her second day, a small betrayal of sentiment she allowed herself only because hunger makes philosophers of everyone eventually, and used the proceeds to secure a single week's room above a dye house that reeked of indigo and boiled onions. It was there on her third night in the city that a woman with iron-gray hair and eyes like two chips of flint let herself into the room without knocking, sat down across the single rickety table, and said without preamble, "You're the seneschal they hanged in effigy in Ashmere Square last week, or you're about to be once word of your escape finishes traveling. Which is it?" Elira's hand went instinctively to the small kitchen knife she'd bought that morning. The woman didn't so much as blink at the movement. "My name is Myra," the woman continued, unbothered. "I know most things that happen in this city within a day of them happening, and most things that happen in Virelane within a week. It's how I've stayed alive in a business that kills most people who practice it. And I know, Seneschal, that the grain diversion you were hanged for wasn't yours. Because I've been tracking the real smuggling route out of Ashmere for 11 months, on behalf of a client who very much wants to know who's been undercutting his black market grain prices, and the name at the top of that route isn't Elira Voss." Elira went very still. "Then whose name is it?" Myra smiled, thin and sharp as her own flint-colored eyes. "That's the interesting part," she said. "The paperwork's clean, too clean. Someone with real access to the royal seal set this up years before your trial ever happened, built it slow and quiet so it would never trace back to him even if someone came looking. Someone patient. Someone close enough to the crown that no investigator would think to look twice." She leaned forward. "I think you already have a guess who that is, Seneschal. I think that's exactly why you're sitting in my city instead of running for the border like every other frightened noble who's ever fled a false conviction." Elira didn't answer immediately. She was doing the thing she always did, running the numbers, weighing risk against information, trying to determine whether the woman across the table was an opportunity or a trap dressed convincingly as one. "What do you want?" she finally asked. "You didn't come here out of charity." "No," Myra agreed. "I came here because a woman who ran an entire kingdom's finances for 15 years, who understands trade routes and treaty law, and exactly how deep Lord Cashin Dreeth's fingers go into every corrupt vein of this kingdom's economy, is worth considerably more to me alive and grateful than dead and unremarkable. I run information in this city, Seneschal. You could be the single most valuable source I've had in a decade if you survive long enough to be useful, which currently is not guaranteed." There was something almost insulting about the bluntness of it, and Elira found, to her own surprise, that she preferred it enormously to the polished cruelty of Thornhold's court. At least the Shadow City didn't pretend to love her while planning her execution. "And if I refuse your offer?" "Then I wish you luck," Myra said, rising from the rickety chair entirely unoffended. "You'll need considerably more of it than you've had so far, given that the men Cashin Dreeth has already sent to this city to make certain you never testify against him arrived 2 days before you did." Elira's blood went cold. "You knew," she said slowly, "that I was walking into an ambush, and you let me sit here talking about my usefulness instead of telling me first." Myra paused at the door, and for the first time something that might almost have been sympathy crossed her weathered face. "I wanted to see," she said, "whether you'd panic when I told you or whether you'd start planning. Panic tells me you're a liability. Planning tells me you're the kind of person worth building an alliance around." She opened the door onto the dark corridor beyond. "You didn't panic, Seneschal, not even for a moment. So, would you like to hear what I know about the 3 assassins currently drinking themselves stupid 2 streets over, or would you rather wait for them to find you first?" They did not wait for the assassins to find her. Myra, it turned out, had already arranged for the 3 men to be occupied elsewhere for the evening, a small, efficient act of sabotage involving a rigged card game and a great deal of very strong Kelmore brandy, buying Elira precisely enough time to slip out of the dye house and into the deeper warrens of the city, where Myra kept what she called with a dry twist of humor her office. It was in truth a converted smuggler's cellar 3 levels beneath a defunct chandlery, reachable only through a hidden stair behind a false shelf of tallow candles, and it was there over the following 2 weeks. That Elira Voss began building something she had never once considered building in 15 years of faithful service to a crown that had just tried to kill her, a resistance. Myra brought the first ally within 4 days, a woman named Talia Windmere. Once a general of Virelane's Eastern legions discharged in disgrace 3 years earlier, after a border skirmish went badly wrong under mysterious circumstances, that Elira quickly realized upon hearing the details bore Cashin Dreith's fingerprints as clearly as the grain treaty had. Talia had been blamed for a tactical failure that Elira suspected within the hour had actually been caused by deliberately falsified supply reports. The exact same method, the exact same architecture of blame, applied years earlier to a different victim. "He's done this before," Talia said flatly, sitting across the cellar's single scarred table, her weathered soldier's hands wrapped around a cup of bitter tea. "Find someone loyal, someone trusted, someone whose downfall would be believed without much question, buries his own failure inside their record. Lets them take the fall while he stands beside the throne looking heartbroken about it." She looked up at Elira with something that wasn't quite a smile. "You're not his first victim, Seneschal. You're just the first one smart enough and angry enough to come looking for the others." The second ally arrived a week later, summoned by Myra through channels Elira didn't fully understand, and wasn't entirely sure she wanted to. A heavyset merchant lord named Otto Ferris, exiled from the royal court's trading concessions 2 years prior after being accused. On evidence Elira now recognized with sick familiarity as suspiciously convenient of underweighting his grain shipments. His entire fortune, his family's 3-generation trading legacy, had collapsed in the space of a single council ruling. "I didn't cheat anyone," Otto said, his voice thick with an old, banked fury that clearly hadn't cooled in 2 years. "I built my house's reputation on honest weight for 30 years. And then Lord Dreith's people started discovering shortfalls in shipments I'd personally inspected before they left my warehouse. I still don't know how he did it. I only know that within a month I went from the wealthiest grain trader in the eastern provinces to a man selling his own furniture to eat." Elira sat back, looking around the candlelit cellar at the 3 faces gathered there, a disgraced general, a ruined merchant, a spymaster who traded in secrets for a living, and herself, the newest and most public casualty of a pattern she was only now beginning to fully understand. "He doesn't just eliminate rivals," she said slowly, thinking aloud the way she used to over the Queen's ledgers, watching the numbers arrange themselves into a shape. "He harvests them. Every person he destroys for a reason. Your trading routes, Otto, folded directly into networks he now controls. Your legion's supply contracts, Talia, redirected to merchants loyal to him. My oversight of the treasury, replaced by whoever he installs next, someone who won't flag his private arrangements the way I nearly did before I learned to stop asking questions." She looked up. This isn't a man protecting one secret. This is a man who has spent years quietly converting the entire machinery of this kingdom's trade and treasury into something that serves him first, and the crown second. And he has done it by making sure every honest person who might have noticed ended up disgraced, exiled, or dead before they could speak. The cellar was silent for a long moment. "Then it isn't just your name that needs clearing," Talia said finally, quiet and grim. "It's the entire kingdom that needs waking up." "And a kingdom that wakes up angry," Myra added, with the thin, sharp smile of someone who had been waiting a long time to say something like this out loud, "tends to remember who woke it." Elira looked around the table once more at the ruined general. The ruined merchant, the woman who traded in other people's secrets, because the world had never given her anything safer to trade in, and felt something shift inside her chest that she hadn't felt since the night Bren Halloway turned a stolen key in a cell door. Not hope exactly. Hope had gotten her hanged in effigy already, something colder and far more useful: purpose. "Then we don't just clear my name," she said. "We take apart everything he's built piece by piece the same patient way he built it. And when we're finished, Lord Cashin Dreith is going to learn exactly what it feels like to watch the ground he's standing on disappear beneath him, one careful, undeniable ledger entry at a time." Nobody in that cellar noticed in the warmth of that first fragile alliance. The small folded note that had already left Kelmore 2 nights earlier, carried by a writer Myra herself had failed to account for, addressed in a merchant's disguised hand to Lord Cashin Dreith himself, informing him that the seneschal he'd buried alive had just crawled back out of her grave, and was no longer alone. They spent a month building their case before they made a single move against Cashin Dreith, and Elira insisted on every one of those 30 days, over Talia's growing impatience. "He has spent years making sure his lies are unfalsifiable," she explained one evening. Spreading a new set of documents across the cellar table, Copies painstakingly reconstructed from Otto's old shipping manifests, Talia's, surviving supply records, and Myra's network of scribes and dock workers who owed her favors going back a decade. If we strike too early, with evidence that's merely suggestive rather than conclusive, he will do exactly what he did to all three of us: bury the truth under a more convenient story before anyone in power has to actually look at it directly. We are not trying to convince ourselves, my friends, we already know. We are trying to build something so complete that even a queen determined not to see it will have no choice but to. So they built. Otto, using contacts he still had among the honest merchant houses who never quite believed the charges against him, began quietly tracing the black market grain routes forward from Ashmere, mapping exactly which ports and buyers had absorbed the diverted shipments over the past 3 years. Talia, drawing on old loyalties from her Legion days, identified a pattern of falsified supply requisitions stretching back nearly 5 years, always routed through offices Cashin controlled, always timed to coincide with a rival officer's sudden disgrace. Myra's network combed the taverns and counting houses of half a dozen port cities, gathering testimony from smaller players in Cashin's smuggling operation, men and women who had never been paid what they were promised, and were, Myra noted dryly, remarkably willing to talk once they understood their silence was buying someone else's fortune and not their own. Elira's contribution was the one no one else in that cellar could have provided. She rebuilt, from raw memory and painstaking cross-reference, 3 years of royal treasury ledgers exactly as they should have read, had every diverted shipment, every falsified requisition, and every laundered gold payment been properly recorded. When she laid the true version beside the forged one the court had convicted her with, the discrepancy was not subtle. It was not even arguable. It was a straight, damning line running directly from Rothmere Gold to Ashmere warehouses to Cashin Dreith's personal accounts, hidden behind 3 shell merchants whose ownership Otto eventually confirmed through an old friend in the guild registry, traced back to Cashin's own late mother's maiden name. He used his own mother's name to hide the money, Talia said, staring at the discovery with something between disgust and grim admiration. Careless or arrogant, both, Elira said. Men like Cashin believe carefulness is something other people need because they've never once been made to answer for a mistake in their entire lives. That belief is the single largest weakness he has, and we are going to use it against him. Their first move when it finally came was small and deliberately invisible, not an accusation but a disruption. Using Otto's contacts and Myra's couriers, they quietly redirected one shipment from Cashin's smuggling network. A modest cargo of black market grain bound for a corrupt buyer in the southern port of Calderist, rerouting it instead to the very Ashmere villages it had been stolen from in the first place, distributed anonymously under cover of night, by a dozen of Myra's most trusted runners. It cost Cashin almost nothing in coin. It cost him something far more valuable and far harder to replace: certainty. For 3 years, his network had run without a single misstep, without a single shipment lost to anything but ordinary misfortune. Now, without warning, without explanation, a single cargo had simply vanished from his control and reappeared exactly where it should have gone all along. A gesture so quiet and so specific that only someone who understood precisely what had been stolen and from whom could possibly have arranged it. He would know, Elira reasoned, sitting in the cellar and watching the candle burn low that first night. He would know instantly that this wasn't chance. And a man who has spent years believing himself untouchable does not respond to the first crack in that belief with calm. She was right. Word reached them 4 days later through one of Myra's dock contacts that Lord Cashin Dreith had personally interrogated 3 of his own smuggling lieutenants over the missing shipment, and that one of them, a nervous, low-ranking dock clerk who had never actually done anything wrong, had simply disappeared afterward and never been seen again. The cellar went quiet when Myra delivered the news. "That's on us," Otto said, his broad face gray with something close to guilt. "We took one shipment to make a point and a man is dead for it." "No," Elira said, and her voice was harder than any of them had heard it since Kelmore. "That death is on Cashin Dreith, exactly the same way mine would have been on Cashin Dreith if Bren Halloway hadn't come to my cell with a stolen key. We did not kill that clerk. We revealed, once again, exactly what kind of man we are dealing with. A man who murders his own people the instant they become inconvenient to him. Every person in this cellar needs to understand, clearly tonight, precisely what we are choosing to fight. This was never going to be bloodless. I am sorry that it isn't. But the alternative was letting that same man continue exactly as he has for the last 5 years, taking whoever he needed and calling it the cost of ambition." Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Talia, who had buried more soldiers than any of them could count, finally broke the silence. "She's right," the old general said quietly. "Grief for that clerk is fair. Guilt for his death belongs entirely to the man who ordered it. If we let guilt slow us down now, more people like him die waiting for us to work up the courage to keep going." She looked around the table. "We move faster, not recklessly, but faster. Because every day Cashin Dreeth keeps his throne beside the crown is another day someone innocent pays for a crime he committed." Elira nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the decision settle into her chest alongside the grief, the two of them learning together to occupy the same space. "Then let's give him something considerably larger to panic over," she said, "than one missing shipment of grain." What none of them yet understood was that their small, deliberate disruption had done more than crack Cashin Dreeth's certainty. It had, without their intending it, set something loose in the man that made him considerably more dangerous, not less. Cashin Dreeth had spent 5 years building an empire of quiet theft on a single foundational belief: that he was smarter than everyone around him, including the queen he claimed to love, including the honest servants he'd systematically destroyed to protect himself. That belief had survived Elira's trial, survived Talia's disgrace, survived Otto's ruin, because in each case he had controlled every variable, every witness, every forged page. The missing shipment was the first thing to happen to him in 5 years that he had not personally arranged, and it terrified him in a way that pure accusation never could have. He responded the way frightened, powerful men have always responded throughout history, by narrowing his circle and widening his violence. Within a fortnight, 2 more of Myra's low-level contacts in Kelmore's dock quarter vanished. A merchant who'd once done honest business with Otto's family and had quietly agreed to testify to the fraudulent underweighting scheme was found dead in an alley behind his own warehouse, his death arranged to look like an ordinary robbery gone wrong. Except, as Talia grimly pointed out. Examining the details, Myra brought back, robbers rarely leave a man's coin purse untouched while taking nothing but his life. "He's cleaning house," Myra said, her flint eyes harder than Elira had yet seen them. "Every loose thread he can identify, he's cutting. And Seneschal, some of the threads he's cutting are getting uncomfortably close to us." It was Bren Halloway, still stationed at Thornhold, and passing information north through a careful chain of intermediaries Myra had established weeks earlier, who sent word of the most dangerous development yet. Cashin had convinced Queen Marin to authorize a formal manhunt for Elira Voss, no longer framed merely as the pursuit of an escaped traitor, but now expanded with Cashin's careful language into the pursuit of a fugitive conspiracy actively working to destabilize the crown from within Kelmore's criminal underworld. A description Elira noted bitterly that was considerably closer to the truth than anything said about her at the original trial, which was precisely what made it so effective. "He's not wrong," Otto said grimly, reading the intercepted directive by candlelight. "We are exactly that now. He's just using the truth to hunt us instead of a lie, which somehow feels worse." "It should feel worse," Elira said. "It means he's finally taking us seriously enough to stop relying purely on forgery. That's not a setback, Otto. That's confirmation we're close enough to frighten him." But it was Talia who voiced the fear all of them had been quietly carrying since the dock clerk's disappearance. "Close enough to frighten him also means close enough for him to stop being patient," she said. "A patient man builds forged ledgers over 5 years and waits for the right trial to bury his enemies quietly, one at a time, with plausible deniability intact. A frightened man sends soldiers into a city he doesn't control to drag a fugitive out by force, evidence or no evidence, and worries about the paperwork afterward. We need to assume from this point forward that he is no longer playing the long, careful game he's played for 5 years. He is playing to survive the next month. That makes him unpredictable, and unpredictable men are the most dangerous kind." She was right. And the proof of it arrived only 3 nights later in the form of 6 of the Queen's soldiers. Real soldiers, not smugglers or hired blades. Dispatched under a royal warrant that Cashin had clearly pushed through the council with a speed that spoke to exactly how much fear now drove him. Descending on Kelmore's dock quarter with orders to search every known safehouse, tavern, cellar, and abandoned warehouse for the fugitive seneschal and her known associates. Myra's network gave them perhaps 4 hours warning, delivered by a breathless runner who'd nearly killed her horse getting the message north in time. It was, by a narrow margin, enough. They abandoned the smuggler's cellar that same night, scattering into 3 separate safe houses across the city that Myra had quietly prepared weeks earlier, precisely for a contingency none of them had wanted to seriously imagine until it was suddenly, urgently real. Elira spent that flight crouched in the false bottom of a fishmonger's cart, breathing through a cloth soaked in enough brine to make her eyes water, listening to the muffled sound of soldiers' boots, passing within a few feet of her hiding place and thinking. With a clarity that surprised her even in the moment that precisely this hunted and hidden and utterly certain of her own innocence, was still somehow an improvement over the calm, rehearsed cruelty of Marin's throne room. At least here, she thought, the danger is honest about what it wants. When the soldiers finally withdrew near dawn, having found nothing but empty rooms and cold hearths, Elira emerged from the cart into the gray Kelmore morning to find Myra waiting for her at the appointed rendezvous, her usual composure visibly shaken for the first time since Elira had known her. "We survived tonight," Myra said quietly, "but he's not going to stop. And Seneschal, I think it's time you accepted something the rest of us have been dancing around for weeks." "What's that?" "Slow and patient worked once when we had the luxury of time and he had the luxury of believing himself safe," Myra said. "He no longer believes he's safe. Which means our slow, patient plan to bury him under a mountain of undeniable evidence, presented carefully to a queen who might finally have to listen, that plan assumes we still have months to build it. We don't. I think we have weeks, possibly less." She held Elira's gaze steadily. "It's time to stop building the case quietly from the shadows and start finding a way to force it directly in front of the one person whose word can actually end this, Queen Marin Thalira herself. Which means, Seneschal, that sooner or later, probably sooner, you are going to have to walk back through the gates of the city that sentenced you to die." Getting back into Thornhold Castle was, in the end, easier than getting out of it had been, though far more dangerous, because this time, Elira Voss intended to be seen. The plan, once she laid it out for the others, made Otto go pale and made even Talia hesitate before slowly, reluctantly nodding. "You want to walk into the one place in this kingdom where every soldier has orders to kill you on sight," Otto said. "And you want to do it during the autumn accord, in front of every noble house in Virelane." "I want to do it because it's the one place in this kingdom where every noble house in Virelane will already be gathered in a single room," Elira said. "Cashin has spent 5 years operating in shadows and quiet forgeries precisely because darkness is where his kind of lie survives. He cannot forge evidence fast enough to counter a full public reveal, not with the entire court watching, not with witnesses from 3 separate provinces standing in the same hall. If we bring the truth to him privately, he buries it. If we bring it to everyone at once, in front of the queen, in front of the assembled lords, in front of people whose own trade routes and reputations he's quietly destroyed over the years, he has nowhere left to hide it." Bren Halloway, who had risked everything once already to save her, risked it again, using his position within the castle guard to arrange the small essential details that made the plan possible at all. A service entrance left conveniently unwatched during the accord's opening ceremonies. A guard rotation schedule shared weeks in advance, and most crucially, a quiet word passed to 3 fellow guards he trusted with his life, men who had served alongside him long enough to have their own private doubts about the Seneschal's guilt. Talia, meanwhile, spent the 2 weeks before the accord doing something considerably more dangerous than infiltration. She rode under a false name and a hooded cloak to the eastern provinces, where her old legion still remembered her, and quietly gathered 5 retired officers willing to testify under oath to the falsified supply reports that had ended her career. Otto did the same among the merchant houses, calling in decades of honest reputation to secure the testimony of 2 guild masters willing to confirm, publicly, the shell company ownership tracing back to Cashin's late mother's name. And Myra did what Myra did best. She made certain that on the night of the Accord's Grand Assembly, when 6 armed guards under Cashin's personal command were dispatched to quietly seal every exit from the Great Hall, as a precaution against the fugitives' known associates. Those guards found the doors already sealed from the outside by locks none of them had keys, for courtesy of a locksmith who owed Myra a debt considerably larger than his conscience could otherwise bear. The night of the accord, Elira stood in the shadowed alcove behind the Great Hall's northern gallery, watching through a gap in the tapestry, as Queen Marin Thalira took her seat upon the ceremonial throne. Cashin Dreeth standing at her right hand, exactly where he had stood for every important moment of the last 5 years, dressed in the deep court colors of a man utterly secure in his own untouchability. Her heart was pounding so hard she was certain the guards 2 feet away must be able to hear it. She thought, unexpectedly, of the old seneschal who had first seen something worth keeping in a 12-year-old bookkeeper's daughter. She thought of Bren's shaking hands turning a stolen key. She thought of a dock clerk whose name she had never learned, dead because she had disrupted a single shipment of grain. She thought of Marin once falling asleep against her shoulder over a candle and a spread of unpaid debts, saying, "You're the only honest voice in this whole gilded room." Then she stepped out from behind the tapestry, into the full light of the great hall, in front of every noble house in Virelane. The gasp that swept the room was audible even over the musicians, who faltered mid-note and fell silent one instrument at a time as the recognition spread outward from the front rows like ripples across still water. Guards moved toward her instantly, hands going to sword hilts, and for one heart-stopping moment Elira thought Myra's locked doors and Bren's careful arrangements had somehow failed, that this entire desperate gambit would end not with a trial but with a blade right here in front of the throne. Stop. The word came from Marin herself, rising half out of her seat, one hand raised, her face drained of every scrap of its careful, rehearsed composure. For 5 years, Elira had learned to read every flicker of the Queen's expression from across a council table. She read this one instantly, shock yes and fear of the chaos unfolding in her own great hall, but beneath both of those, unmistakable and raw, something that looked almost like relief. Your Grace. Elira's voice rang out across the silent hall, steadier than she had any right to expect it to be. 5 years ago, you told me you needed one honest voice in this castle more than you needed comfort. I have spent every day since the night I escaped your executioner's rope trying to bring you exactly that. I did not come back tonight to beg for my life. I came back because I have finally gathered enough truth that even Lord Cashin Dreith's 5 years of careful forgery cannot bury it. Cashin's composure, which had weathered a trial, a manhunt, and a dozen quiet murders without visibly cracking, finally began unmistakably to fracture. Your Grace, this woman is a convicted traitor standing in violation of a royal death sentence, he said, his voice rising with an urgency that sounded, for the first time in 5 years, genuinely afraid rather than performed. Whatever fabricated story she has concocted in whatever criminal den she's been hiding in, it does not belong in this hall, and it certainly does not belong interrupting the accord in front of every visiting lord in the kingdom. Then you should have no fear of hearing it, Talia Winmer's voice cut across the hall, as the disgraced general stepped out from among the assembled retired officers seated near the eastern gallery, 5 of her old comrades rising alongside her. Since apparently, cousin to the crown, fabricated stories fall apart quite easily under honest questioning, unless of course you have some particular reason to fear this one won't. Otto Ferris rose next from among the merchant delegation, 2 guild masters standing with him. Then near the back of the hall, 3 of Bren Halloway's fellow guards moved quietly to stand between Cashin's remaining loyal soldiers and the sealed doors, not attacking, simply present, a wall of quiet, deliberate witness. Marin Thalira looked out across her own great hall, at the seneschal she had sentenced to death standing very much alive in front of her, at a disgraced general and a ruined merchant, and a chain of witnesses she had never once thought to seek out. At her own cousin's face for the very first time in 5 years, showing something other than calm, rehearsed confidence, and Elira watched the last of the Queen's carefully maintained certainty crumble in real time. Let her speak, Marin said very quietly and then louder to the guards still hesitating near the throne. Stand down, all of you, let her speak. Elira Voss had spent 15 years learning how to make a room understand what its numbers truly meant, and in the hour that followed, standing before the assembled nobility of Virelane with Marin Thalira watching from the ceremonial throne, she used every fragment of that skill. She did not shout. She did not weep, though every eye in that hall watched for exactly that, waiting for the broken, desperate performance of an escaped traitor pleading for mercy. Instead, she laid out the truth the way she had once laid out treasury reports, methodically, patiently, letting the evidence build its own unanswerable weight. She showed the forged pages from her own trial and beside them. The true ledger she had reconstructed from memory across weeks in a smuggler's cellar, the discrepancies so precise and so damning that even lords who had never once questioned the original verdict found themselves leaning forward calculating the sums for themselves. She called Talia's 5 retired officers, who testified in steady, soldierly voices to falsified supply reports stretching back years before Elira's own trial, establishing beyond doubt that this was not one isolated fabrication but a pattern, repeated and refined, against victim after victim. She called Otto's guild masters who confirmed, with guild records that could not be forged on short notice, that 3 shell merchant houses profiting from black market Ashmere grain traced their ownership directly to Lord Cashin Dreith's late mother's maiden name, a detail so specific, so damningly personal, that a ripple of open murmuring finally broke across the assembled court. And last, she called upon Myra, who did not step fully into the light, remaining instead at the hall's edge in the manner of someone who had survived a lifetime by never quite being seen. but who spoke clearly enough for every ear in the hall to hear her recount in unflinching detail the deaths of a nervous dock clerk and an honest merchant, both silenced within days of becoming inconvenient to Lord Cashin Dreath. Both murders arranged to look like ordinary misfortune, by a man who had by then grown considerably too confident in his own untouchability to be as careful as he once was. Cashin tried twice to interrupt, the first time with outrage, the second with something closer to pleading, his golden composure entirely stripped away now, replaced by the raw, cornered fury of a man watching 5 years of careful architecture collapse in the space of a single hour. But the hall had turned. Elira felt it turn the way she used to feel a council's mood shift over a difficult budget, a slow accumulation of small nods and murmured asides crystallizing, finally, into something the assembled lords could no longer politely ignore. It was Marin in the end who ended it, rising from the ceremonial throne, her voice carrying the particular steadiness of someone who has finally stopped protecting a comfortable lie and started facing an uncomfortable truth. Cousin. She said the word the way one might set down something heavy she had carried too long. Look at me and tell me, honestly, for the first time in 5 years, whether any part of what has just been laid before this court is untrue. Cashin Dreath looked at his queen for a long, silent moment, and then, for the first time since the grain treaty had failed and an innocent woman had been sentenced to die in his place, his carefully maintained composure simply gave out entirely. He did not confess in noble terms. He confessed the way frightened, cornered men usually do in fragments, in justifications, blaming Rothmere gold and desperate debts, and a conviction that he, cousin to the crown, deserved considerably more than the kingdom had ever formally given him. It was neither dignified nor sympathetic, and Elira, watching the man who had orchestrated her execution finally unravel in front of the entire court, felt something she had not expected to feel in that moment. Not triumph, not quite, but a quiet, exhausted relief. The particular relief of finally setting down a weight she had carried, since the night a stolen key turned in a cell door. The formal proceedings that followed took weeks. Treason trials for a queen's own cousin are never simple, and Marin, to her credit, insisted this one be conducted with a rigor and transparency her own council had denied Elira entirely. Cashin Dreath was stripped of his titles. His shell holdings seized and redistributed to the eastern provinces, his smuggling had starved, and sentenced to lifelong exile on a fortress island off Virelane's northern coast. A mercy some lords muttered that he had never once shown any of his victims. Though Elira herself had quietly argued for exactly that mercy in the queen's private chambers 3 nights before the sentence was passed. You could have asked for his death, Marin said to her then, the two of them alone with a candle and a spread of documents for the first time in over a year, an echo of 100 nights from years before neither of them had forgotten. After everything he took from you, I would have granted it without hesitation. I know, Elira said. I thought about it. I spent a great many nights in a cold cell thinking about very little else, if I'm honest with you, your grace. But revenge built on a corpse is just another kind of ledger that never balances, no matter how satisfying the first entry feels. I would rather he spend the rest of his life on that island understanding exactly what he lost, and exactly why, than have him spend one final moment as a martyr for people foolish enough to believe his last performance. She met the queen's eyes steadily. I did not build an alliance to become the next person in this kingdom who destroys their enemies without proof and without mercy. I built it to prove there was still a way to seek justice honestly, even after everything honest had been taken from me. That matters more to me than his death would. Marin was quiet for a long moment. I doubted you, she finally said, and it cost her visibly to say it, the queen's careful composure cracking in a way Elira had not seen since that final morning in the trial chamber. In the one moment it mattered most, I let a lifetime of loving my cousin outweigh 15 years of trusting you. I don't know how to give you back what that doubt cost you. Your office, your years. The people who died because I was too afraid to look closely enough at the man standing beside my throne. You can't give any of that back, Elira said, not unkindly because it was simply true. But you offered me your seal back 3 days ago, your grace, and I have spent those 3 days deciding not to take it. Marin looked up, startled. I spent 15 years believing my worth was measured entirely by how completely I served this crown, Elira continued. I nearly died still believing that. I would like, for the first time in my life, to build something that belongs to me rather than to the palace that once decided, in a single afternoon, that my worth could be erased with a forged signature. Talia Otto Myra. And I intend to establish an independent trade and treasury council answerable to the crown, but not owned by it. One built specifically to catch exactly the kind of quiet, patient corruption that nearly killed all four of us before anyone in power thought to look for it. I would like your blessing for that counsel, your grace, not your ownership of it. Marin studied her for a long moment, and something that might almost have been pride crossed the queen's tired face. You have it, she said. And Elira, for whatever it's worth, however late it comes. Thank you for coming back through gates that had every reason to stay closed to you forever. Elira thought of Bren's shaking hands, of Myra's flint-colored eyes, of Talia's steady soldier's voice, of Otto's ruined fortune rebuilt one honest testimony at a time, of a dock clerk whose name she had finally learned and would never again forget. She thought of a 12-year-old girl arriving at Thornhold's gates with a satchel of borrowed ledgers, certain that her only worth lay in how completely she could disappear into someone else's service. I didn't come back for the gates, your grace, she said quietly. I came back because I finally understood something a false conviction, and a stolen key taught me in the end better than 15 years of loyal service ever did. The people who try to bury you alive are almost always terrified of what you'll become. If you simply refuse to stay in the ground, I refused. That is the only justice I ever truly needed. She left the palace that same night, not through a smuggler's tunnel this time, but through the front gates in the open under her own name. With 3 allies waiting for her in the torchlit courtyard, who had once been a disgraced general, a ruined merchant, and a spymaster who traded in secrets, because the world had never given her anything safer to trade in, and who were now all of them simply free.